Jacob fled to the country of Syria. Jacob fled to the country of Aram in Hebrew. When he went through Bethel, he was going to Aram to work for Laban, where he got his wives and children. Israel served for a spouse. We see there what I just said. Jacob fled to the country of Syria. Yahweh fled to the Jacob fled to the country of Aram. Israel served for a spouse because he worked 7 years for his wife, but then they gave him Leah. So then he worked 7 more years for Rachel. So he worked 14 years for wives. Although one could say that he worked 14 years for Rachel, because the first 7 were supposed to be for Rachel, but he got Leah. So he worked 14 years, which is the numerical value of David, King David. So Jacob representing how he would become, in this case, the ancestor of King David, but then how the last, who is the branch of David, would be represented by Jacob. And just like Jacob have Rachel and Leah, that is to show how the last comes from the few and the many. Just like Rachel or Rachel only had 2 children and Leah had 6. Then the concubines became wives also, but they are pretty much extensions of the first 2, Rachel and Leah. So Jacob fled to the country of Aram. That is to show that the last, the second coming, as it's making reference in the previous verses, would come not as the first, who was in the land of Israel. Yahushua came to Israel for the lost tribes of Israel and died in Israel. The last will flee from Israel in the sense that he won't be born there, but he will come to the earth through the nations, because Israel itself was scattered. So when the last is born, he's born within those nations where Israel was scattered, because the first time he was supposed to come to Israel, the second time to the nations, so that Yahweh gets to be known from where the sun comes out to where it hides, from the east to the west. So Jacob fled to the country of Aram, representing going to the nations. Israel served for a spouse. The last receives a new name, as Jacob became Israel, to begin a ministry so that he can get a spouse. So he works for a wife because he is the one, as the good shepherd, who works for the sheep of Yahweh, but those sheep are actually the congregation, and the congregation is the wife of Mashiach. So the last comes and works for a wife because he comes as Mashiach to marry his bride, the congregation, the chosen few. Also could be seen as, since he comes twice and there are 2 parts of the people, the few and the many, Yahushua said, this is the blood that is spilled for the many, can be seen as one marrying the many, just like Jacob married first Leah and then the last marrying Rachel, the few. So that's why he came and spilled the blood for the many, and now comes and died for the few. And the few and the many will become one at the end, just like first and last will become one. And in the wedding of the Lamb, we see that the fulfillment of him being married after having worked and suffered on earth through his ministry. So Israel served for a spouse. The last comes and serves Yahweh to receive a wife, meaning the congregation. And for a wife he tended sheep. Another confirmation of what I was saying, how I connected sheep with the wife. And we see here how both interpretations are being given. He worked for a spouse, he received Leah. And then he says, and for a wife he tended sheep. That was his job, to tend sheep, to get a wife. And the fact that it says spouse and wife, and it said Jacob and Israel, is to show how he married 2 who had 2 extensions, Bila and Silpa. So Israel served for a spouse, Leah, and for a wife, Rachel, he tended sheep. Interestingly enough, Rachel means sheep. So it says Israel served for a spouse, and for a wife he tended sheep. The service could also be said for the many who will serve, and the sheep as the few who follow the good shepherd.